The sky isn't always friendly. The steady hum of jet engines filled the air as passengers settled into their seats aboard Flight 527. It was a full house, and the atmosphere buzzed with the usual mix of anticipation, impatience, and casual chatter. In the first-class cabin, the ambience was more subdued. An air of quiet luxury enveloped the spacious leather seats and the subtle clink of glasses filled with premium beverages. Elise Moore, a flight attendant with over a decade of experience, moved briskly between the rows, her polished demeanor radiating authority. Her uniform was crisp, and her blonde hair pinned in a flawless bun as she greeted passengers with practiced smiles. It was her fourth flight of the week, and fatigue was beginning to creep in, but she maintained her professional poise. Yet something about her today seemed different. Among the passengers in first class were Isaac and Rachel Thompson, a couple in their late 30s. Isaac, a seasoned entrepreneur, had built a tech company from the ground up, while Rachel was a tenacious civil rights attorney. They were no strangers to success or the finer things in life. Their confident, yet unassuming demeanor fit perfectly in this exclusive cabin. This trip was a celebration of Rachel's latest courtroom victory, one that had brought justice to a wrongfully imprisoned young man. The couple planned to relax in the Caribbean for a long weekend, away from the grind of their demanding lives. Champagne or sparkling water? Elise asked as she approached their seats, her tone professional but cool. Rachel smiled politely. "Sparkling water, please," she replied. Isaac glanced up from his tablet, catching a flicker of something unusual in Elise's expression, a hint of hesitation, almost as if she was sizing them up. He dismissed the thought and returned to his work. Moments later, Elise returned with their drinks, her movements precise, but her gaze lingering a second too long before walking away. Rachel, ever perceptive, leaned toward Isaac. "Did you notice that?" she whispered. Isaac shrugged. "She's probably just tired." Rachel gave a non-committal hum, but made a mental note. Years in the courtroom had sharpened her ability to read people, and Elise's demeanor left her unsettled. As the passengers prepared for takeoff, Elise reappeared, this time with a clipboard in hand. She stopped abruptly in front of the Thompsons, her smile replaced by a tight-lipped expression. "Excuse me," Elise said, her tone clipped. "I'll need to see your boarding passes again." Rachel's brows knitted in confusion. "Is there a problem?" she asked, maintaining her calm. "It's just a routine check," Elise replied curtly, her eyes darting to the couple's matching travel bags. Isaac handed over his boarding pass without a word. Rachel followed suit, her lawyer instincts kicking in. Elise examined the passes with meticulous scrutiny, flipping them over as if expecting to find something incriminating. "These were scanned at the gate," Rachel said, her voice steady. "We've been cleared for these seats." Elise looked up, her expression unreadable. "I'll be back shortly," she said before walking briskly to the galley. Rachel's eyes followed her retreating figure. "Something's off," she muttered. "Don't jump to conclusions," Isaac replied, though the set of his jaw betrayed his unease. "Let's wait and see." But waiting proved difficult. Minutes ticked by, and the murmurs of other passengers began to ripple through the cabin. Rachel caught snippets of whispered conversations. "Is there an issue with their tickets?" One woman speculated. "Maybe they're on standby," another man suggested. Rachel clenched her fists under the table, feeling the weight of the stares creeping in. Isaac placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "We haven't done anything wrong." Elise returned, her posture even more rigid. "I'm going to need you both to step into the galley," she said firmly. "There's been a discrepancy with your seats." "A discrepancy?" Rachel asked, her voice sharper now. "What kind of discrepancy?" Elise folded her arms. "I'd rather discuss it privately." Isaac stood, his expression calm but his tone edged with warning. "We've complied so far, but this feels unnecessary." The tension in the cabin thickened as Rachel and Isaac followed Elise toward the galley. The aisle felt longer than usual, the weight of the other passengers' stares pressing against their backs. When they reached the galley, Elise turned to face them, her expression colder than before. "These seats are reserved for first-class passengers," Elise said pointedly. Rachel's jaw dropped. "Are you insinuating we don't belong here?" she asked, her voice rising ever so slightly. Elise's eyes narrowed. "I'm saying your tickets might have been issued in error." Isaac stepped forward, his voice measured but firm. "Our tickets were purchased weeks ago. They were scanned without issue. We belong in those seats." Elise opened her mouth to respond, but faltered when Isaac pulled out his phone. "I'm recording this interaction," he said. "If you're accusing us of something, I'd like a clear explanation." Elise stiffened, her confidence visibly shaken. "There's no need for that," she said hastily. "I'm just following protocol." "Then let's clarify this with the captain," Rachel interjected, her tone icy. "I'm not moving until this is resolved properly." The power dynamic shifted in an instant. Elise hesitated, her facade of authority cracking. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the brewing confrontation. As Elise stepped away, Rachel turned to Isaac. "This isn't about our tickets," she said. "This is about us." Isaac nodded solemnly. "And she's about to find out what happens when she picks the wrong fight." The storm brews. The flight hummed along smoothly, yet in the galley of the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was anything but tranquil. Rachel and Isaac stood side by side, their composure intact despite the hostility emanating from Elise, the flight attendant. Elise had returned from speaking with the captain, her face tight with suppressed emotion, though her earlier confidence seemed to have diminished. Rachel, arms crossed, stared Elise down with a gaze sharp enough to cut steel. She had faced seasoned prosecutors in the courtroom and never flinched. A flight attendant with a clipboard was no match. "Let me get this straight," Rachel began, her voice calm but carrying a steely undertone. "You're claiming there's an issue with our seating because you think there was an error with our tickets, despite the fact they were scanned and confirmed at the gate." Elise hesitated, then straightened her posture as if to reclaim some authority. "I've already explained," she said briskly. "Your tickets are under review, and until we clarify the situation, you need to cooperate." Isaac interjected, his tone smooth yet firm. "And how does forcing us out of our seats clarify anything? You haven't provided a single shred of evidence that our tickets are invalid." Elise opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by the sound of a throat clearing behind her. Clara, another flight attendant, stood at the edge of the galley. Unlike Elise, her demeanor was approachable, almost apologetic. "Elise," Clara said carefully, her voice low but urgent, "perhaps we should bring this to the captain's attention before escalating further." Elise shot Clara a withering glare, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "I've already spoken with him," Elise snapped. "This is under control." Clara didn't back down. Her gaze shifted to Isaac and Rachel, and for the first time, they saw an ally in her eyes. "I'm sorry for the confusion," Clara said directly to them, her tone soft and professional. "I'll make sure this is resolved quickly." Rachel inclined her head, acknowledging Clara's effort but refusing to let her guard down. "Thank you," she said, her words measured. "But until it's resolved, we're staying right here." Clara nodded and stepped back, disappearing toward the front of the plane. Elise, clearly rattled by Clara's intervention, turned back to the couple, her expression tight with frustration. "You can stay," Elise said curtly, "but if you disrupt the flight, I will have no choice but to involve security." Rachel tilted her head slightly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Involve security? Over 2 passengers sitting in their assigned seats. Please, go ahead." Isaac stifled a smirk at his wife's unwavering confidence. He admired her ability to hold her ground, even under pressure. But he also knew the situation was far from over. Elise was grasping at straws, and the cracks in her composure were becoming increasingly apparent. Meanwhile, back in the first-class cabin, passengers whispered among themselves. The murmurs grew louder as the minutes passed, and speculation filled the air. "They seemed so polite when they boarded," one woman said to her companion. "Why would the flight attendant single them out?" "I don't know," her companion replied, shaking his head. "But something feels off about this." The man seated directly across the aisle from the Thompsons leaned over to another passenger. "I saw their tickets," he said quietly. "There's no mistake. This is about something else." In the galley, Elise stood rigidly, her arms crossed. Her earlier bravado had been replaced with a defensive posture. "Look," she said, her voice now tinged with irritation. "I don't want to escalate this further. If you're not willing to comply, I'll have to call the authorities." "Go ahead," Isaac replied smoothly. He gestured toward his phone, which was still recording the interaction. "But be prepared to explain yourself on camera." Elise's face paled slightly at the mention of the recording. Her eyes darted toward the camera lens, and for the first time, she seemed uncertain. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Rachel and Isaac were no longer the ones on the defensive. Just then, the intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been informed of an issue in the first-class cabin, and we're working to resolve it. We appreciate your patience and cooperation." The announcement only added fuel to the passengers' curiosity. Whispers intensified, and more eyes turned toward the galley. Clara reappeared, her expression tense but determined. She approached Elise and spoke in a low voice, her words too quiet for Rachel and Isaac to hear. Elise's face hardened, but she nodded begrudgingly and stepped aside. Clara turned to the couple, her tone apologetic. "The captain has asked to speak with you both," she said. "If you'll follow me, I'll escort you to the cockpit." Rachel glanced at Isaac, who gave a subtle nod. "Lead the way," she said to Clara, her voice calm but firm. The walk to the cockpit felt surreal. The whispers of the passengers followed them like an invisible cloud, and Rachel could feel the weight of their gazes on her back. When they reached the cockpit, Clara opened the door and gestured for them to step inside. Captain Douglas was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He stood as they entered, extending a hand in greeting. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone professional. "I apologize for the inconvenience. Please, have a seat." Rachel and Isaac sat in the small jump seats near the cockpit door. The captain remained standing, his expression serious. "I've been briefed on the situation," Captain Douglas began, "and I want to assure you that we're taking it seriously. However, I need to understand exactly what happened from your perspective." Rachel recounted the events in meticulous detail, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. Isaac added his observations, including Elise's initial hesitation and her unfounded accusations. The captain listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little. When they finished, Captain Douglas exhaled deeply. "Thank you for sharing that," he said. "I'll be conducting a full review of this incident once we land. In the meantime, you have my word that no further action will be taken against you during this flight." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "And what about Elise?" she asked pointedly. "Will she be held accountable for her behavior?" The captain hesitated. "That's a matter for the airline's leadership to address," he said carefully. "But I will include my findings in my report." Isaac leaned forward slightly, his expression firm. "With all due respect, Captain, this isn't just about one flight attendant's behavior. It's about the culture that allows this kind of treatment to happen in the first place." Captain Douglas met Isaac's gaze, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I hear you," he said, "and I promise to do everything in my power to ensure this is handled appropriately." As they left the cockpit and returned to their seats, Rachel and Isaac exchanged a glance. The captain's words were reassuring, but they both knew the fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. Unseen forces. Back in their seats, Isaac and Rachel settled into a tense silence. The cabin buzzed with murmurs, every passenger now keenly aware of the ongoing drama. Some whispered their support, others speculated about what could have led to the confrontation. Regardless of their opinions, all eyes occasionally darted toward the couple in seat 2A and 2B, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Rachel adjusted her scarf and glanced at her phone, which buzzed softly in her lap. A notification from a trusted colleague in legal circles read, "Need me to jump in?" Following the updates. Rachel typed a quick response. "Not yet, but stay ready." Isaac leaned over, his voice low. "Back up." She nodded subtly. "Just in case. I don't trust that this ends here." Isaac exhaled and gazed out the window, the city skyline far below blending into the horizon. Despite their calm exteriors, he felt the undercurrent of tension brewing. Rachel was no stranger to systemic challenges. Her work often brought her face to face with the very biases they were now experiencing. But this was different. This was personal. At the same time, Elise lingered in the galley, her usually sharp movements now hesitant. Her grip tightened on a coffee carafe as she pretended to busy herself. Clara's earlier intervention had left a bitter taste in her mouth, and Captain Douglas's measured response did little to quell her frustration. She could feel the passengers' judgment pressing down on her, each whisper like a pinprick against her carefully constructed facade. "Do you think it's them?" a voice behind her asked. Elise spun around to find Dennis, the senior flight attendant, leaning against the galley wall. His tone was neutral, but his eyes betrayed a glimmer of disapproval. "I don't know what you're talking about," Elise replied coolly, though her voice faltered slightly. Dennis arched an eyebrow. "You've been on edge since the boarding process. Now you're questioning passengers with valid tickets and calling the captain into it. This isn't like you, Elise." "It's not your place to question me," Elise snapped, her voice sharp. Dennis raised his hands in mock surrender but didn't back down. "Maybe not," he said, "but I've been with this airline long enough to know when someone's crossing a line. You need to tread carefully." Before Elise could respond, Clara stepped into the galley, her expression a mixture of concern and resolve. "The couple is back in their seats," she said softly, "and the passengers are watching everything we do." Elise sighed, her frustration evident. "I'm just doing my job," she muttered. Clara's eyes narrowed. "Is that what this is? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like something else entirely." The tension between the attendants was palpable. Clara, younger but with a strong sense of right and wrong, was no longer willing to let Elise's behavior slide. She had witnessed enough to know that Elise's actions weren't just about protocol. They were personal. Meanwhile, Rachel and Isaac noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Clara returned to the cabin, her smile faint but reassuring as she checked on other passengers. The whispers had grown louder, and a few passengers even leaned over to offer quiet words of encouragement. "Whatever's happening, you're handling it well," said a woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Don't let them push you around." Rachel nodded politely, her gratitude evident but measured. "Thank you," she said softly. Isaac glanced around, noting the growing support. "They're on our side," he murmured to Rachel. Elise is losing her grip. Before Rachel could respond, a man seated across the aisle spoke up. "If you need a witness, I'm happy to help," he said, his tone firm. "I saw the way she singled you out. It wasn't right." Rachel's lips curved into a small, appreciative smile. "We'll keep that in mind. Thank you." The solidarity from the passengers was a welcome shift, but it also added pressure. Rachel and Isaac understood that their every move was now under a magnifying glass. The stakes were no longer just about their experience. It was about setting a precedent for how such situations should be handled. As the plane continued its smooth journey, Rachel's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from the airline's executive office. The subject line read, "Urgent. Ongoing situation on Flight 527. She opened it quickly, scanning the contents. The email was formal but direct, acknowledging the incident and promising an internal review. Attached was a direct line to a senior executive, should they wish to escalate further. Rachel showed the email to Isaac, who read it with a raised brow. "They're feeling the heat already," he said. "Good," Rachel replied. But I'm not calling until we have more leverage. Let's see how this plays out." Just then, Clara returned, stopping briefly at their seats. Her voice was low, ensuring other passengers wouldn't overhear. "The captain asked me to check in," she said. "Is there anything you need right now?" Rachel shook her head. "We're fine, thank you." "But Clara," she paused, her gaze softening. "You've been professional and kind through all of this. It hasn't gone unnoticed." Clara's cheeks flushed slightly. "Thank you," she said. "I just want to do what's right." As Clara walked away, Isaac leaned toward Rachel. "She's on our side. We'll need her when this escalates." Rachel nodded, her mind already working through the potential next steps. Elise's actions had set off a chain reaction, and the pieces were moving quickly. But Rachel and Isaac were no strangers to high-stakes situations. They thrived under pressure, and they weren't about to let Elise, or anyone else, dictate the outcome. Back in the galley, Elise paced nervously. She could feel her authority slipping away, and the weight of the passenger's judgment was almost unbearable. Dennis watched her silently, his expression a mix of disappointment and frustration. "The lice," he said finally, his voice firm. "You need to step back before you make this worse." She whipped around, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I didn't do anything wrong." Dennis crossed his arms. "Then why does it feel like you're the only one fighting this battle?" Elise opened her mouth to respond but stopped when the intercom crackled again. Captain Douglas's voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. "Flight attendants, please report to the cockpit for a briefing." Dennis shot Elise a meaningful look before heading toward the cockpit. Clara followed, her expression resolute. Elise hesitated, her confidence wavering, but eventually trailed after them. In the first-class cabin, Rachel and Isaac exchanged a glance. The murmurs around them grew quieter as passengers sensed another shift in the tension. Isaac checked his watch and leaned toward Rachel. 7 minutes, he said softly. "Let's see what they decide." The tipping point. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was thick with anticipation, every movement charged with tension. Rachel and Isaac sat calmly in their seats, but their stillness belied the storm brewing beneath. Passengers whispered among themselves, the occasional glance thrown toward the galley, where the flight attendants had disappeared. Rachel turned to Isaac, her voice low and controlled. "If they're regrouping, it means they know they've lost ground." Isaac nodded, his lips set in a firm line. "But losing ground doesn't mean they'll retreat. Elise doesn't strike me as the type to back down." Rachel sighed, leaning back in her seat. "That's what worries me. She'll dig in, even if it means making a bigger mistake." The galley door swung open, and Dennis emerged first, his expression unreadable. Clara followed close behind, her face a mixture of resolve and unease. Elise trailed behind them, her composure faltering under the weight of the cabin's collective gaze. She looked pale, her usual air of authority replaced by an almost defensive posture. The flight attendants returned to their posts, but Elise didn't make her way toward Rachel and Isaac. Instead, she hovered near the galley, her hands busying themselves with menial tasks that betrayed her nervous energy. Clara glanced at her briefly, then turned her attention to the passengers, her professionalism shining through as she resumed her duties. Rachel's phone buzzed softly in her lap. It was a message from a prominent journalist she had worked with in the past, hearing about some tension on a flight. "You involved?" She typed a swift response. "Possibly. We'll confirm soon." She looked at Isaac, who caught the subtle shift in her expression. "Who was that?" he asked. "Someone in the press," she replied. "Word's already getting out." Isaac's brow furrowed slightly. "Let's hope that works to our advantage." The low murmur of conversation among passengers continued, but it grew quieter when the cabin door opened and 2 uniformed security officers stepped aboard. The sight of them caused a ripple of unease through the cabin. Elise's head snapped up, and her eyes darted toward Rachel and Isaac, a flicker of triumph momentarily lighting her face. "Here we go," Isaac muttered under his breath. The officers moved deliberately down the aisle, their presence commanding attention. When they stopped near Rachel and Isaac, the murmurs ceased entirely. The cabin fell silent, save for the hum of the engines. One officer, a man with a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor, spoke first. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson." Rachel met his gaze, her expression calm and unyielding. "Yes. We've been asked to address an issue regarding your seating," the officer said, his tone neutral. "Do you have your boarding passes?" Rachel reached into her bag and handed over the passes without hesitation. "Here you go," she said, her voice steady. The officer examined the passes closely, flipping them over and checking the seat assignments. His partner, a woman with a softer expression but equally professional demeanor, leaned in to look as well. After a few moments, the male officer straightened. "These are valid first-class tickets," he said simply, handing them back. Rachel's lips curved into a faint smile. "Thank you. That's what we've been trying to tell everyone." The female officer glanced toward Elise, who was now hovering uncomfortably near the galley. "Who raised the issue?" she asked. Elise stepped forward, her face flushed but defiant. "I did," she said. "Their behavior has been disruptive, and there's been confusion about their tickets." The male officer turned to Elise, his expression hardening. "We've reviewed their tickets, and there's no issue. What exactly is the problem here?" Elise hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "They've been uncooperative," she said finally, "and their presence has caused disruption among the other passengers." Before the officer could respond, a voice from the back of the cabin cut through the silence. "That's not true." All heads turned toward the source. It was the man who had earlier offered to be a witness. He stood now, his expression firm. "I've been sitting across from them this whole flight. They haven't caused any problems. If anyone's been disruptive, it's her." Several passengers murmured their agreement, and more heads turned toward Elise, their gazes filled with judgment. Elise's face turned crimson, and she took a step back. The male officer looked between the passengers, Rachel and Isaac, and Elise. His expression grew colder. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone edged with disapproval. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, you're free to remain in your seats. We apologize for the inconvenience." Rachel nodded graciously. "Thank you," she said. "But this situation raises larger questions about how this airline handles its passengers." The officer's partner stepped forward, her voice softer. "We'll include everything in our report," she assured them. "And I suggest the airline does a thorough review of its staff's conduct." As the officers turned to leave, Elise stood frozen, her confidence entirely shattered. Clara stepped forward hesitantly, placing a gentle hand on Elise's arm. "Elise," she said softly, "maybe it's time to take a step back." Elise pulled her arm away, her movements jerky and defensive. "I was just doing my job," she muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. The officers left the plane, and the cabin gradually returned to its usual hum. Passengers began murmuring again, but this time, the focus was on Elise. Rachel and Isaac sat quietly, their victory understated but powerful. Isaac leaned toward Rachel. "That was the tipping point," he said. "She's exposed now." Rachel nodded, her gaze fixed on Elise, who was now avoiding eye contact with everyone. "But this isn't just about her," Rachel said. "This is about a system that allows people like her to act this way." The unraveling. The cabin had settled into an uneasy silence, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud. The security officer's departure left a vacuum, and the passengers' attention remained glued to Elise, whose movements had become erratic. She avoided eye contact, her hands trembling as she adjusted trays and rearranged napkins in the galley. Rachel, ever observant, watched her with a calculated calm. "She's spiraling," she whispered to Isaac. Isaac nodded, leaning back in his seat. "Good. She needs to face the consequences of her actions. But we're not finished yet." Elise's behavior hadn't gone unnoticed by the other passengers. The man who had spoken up earlier leaned toward Rachel and Isaac again. "If you need more support," he said, his voice low, Just say the word. A lot of us saw what she did. Rachel offered him a faint smile. Thank you. It means a lot. For now, we'll let the airline decide how they want to handle this. The man nodded and sat back, his expression one of quiet solidarity. In the galley, Clara approached Elise cautiously, her concern etched on her face. Elise, she said softly, maybe you should let Dennis take over. You're not yourself right now. Elise whipped around, her eyes flashing. Don't patronize me, Clara, she snapped. I don't need your pity. Clara flinched but stood her ground. This isn't about pity, she said firmly. It's about doing what's right, for the passengers and for the crew. You've made a mistake, and the longer you push this, the worse it'll get. Elise stared at her, her face a mix of anger and desperation. For a moment, it seemed she might lash out, but then her shoulders slumped, and she looked away. I was just trying to do my job, she muttered, almost to herself. Dennis entered the galley, his expression as stern as ever. Elise, he said, his voice low but authoritative. We need to talk. Clara stepped aside as Dennis gestured for Elise to follow him to the crew quarters. She hesitated but eventually complied, her movements stiff and reluctant. The door closed behind them, leaving Clara alone in the galley. She sighed deeply, running a hand through her hair before returning to the cabin. Clara moved down the aisle, her demeanor professional but weary. When she reached Rachel and Isaac, she paused, leaning in slightly. I just want to say I'm sorry for everything, she said quietly. This isn't how things should be. Rachel met her gaze, her expression softening. It's not your fault, she said. You've been kind and professional throughout this, and we appreciate it. Clara smiled faintly. Thank you, she said. If there's anything else I can do, please let me know. As Clara moved on, Isaac glanced at Rachel. She's genuine, he said, but she's stuck in a system that doesn't protect people like her from people like Elise. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. And that's what needs to change. Behind closed doors, in the cramped crew quarters, Dennis leaned against the counter, arms crossed as he stared Elise down. What were you thinking? He asked, his tone measured but firm. Elise shifted uncomfortably, her arms wrapped around herself. I thought, she began, but Dennis cut her off. That's the problem, he said sharply. You thought. You assumed. And now, because of your assumptions, this entire flight is under scrutiny. Do you have any idea how this reflects on all of us? Elise's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. I wasn't trying to cause a scene, she said defensively. Something didn't feel right about them. Dennis's expression hardened. And that feeling of yours led you to accuse two paying customers with valid tickets of not belonging in first class. Do you hear yourself, Elise? She looked away, her jaw tightening. I was doing my job, she repeated, though the words sounded hollow. Dennis exhaled, his frustration palpable. No, you weren't. You were acting on bias, whether you want to admit it or not. And now it's not just you who will face the fallout. It's the airline, the crew, and everyone who trusted you to act professionally. Elisa's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, refusing to cry in front of Dennis. So what happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That's not up to me, Dennis replied. But if I were you, I'd start thinking about how to own up to this before it's too late. A turning point. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. Clara moved through the rows, ensuring passengers were buckled in and ready for landing. When she reached Rachel and Isaac, she hesitated before speaking. The captain has asked to meet with you once we've landed, she said softly. He'll be waiting at the gate. Rachel raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Thank you for letting us know. Clara gave a small, apologetic smile before moving on. The plane touched down smoothly, and as it taxied to the gate, Rachel and Isaac prepared themselves for the next phase. The passengers around them exchanged knowing looks, their silent support palpable. When the seatbelt sign turned off, Rachel and Isaac remained seated, waiting for the crew to guide them off. As the passengers disembarked, many paused to offer quiet words of encouragement. "Good luck," one woman said. "You handled that with grace," said another. The man who had offered to be a witness gave them a firm nod. "I'll write a statement if you need one," he said. Rachel thanked him, her gratitude sincere. "We'll let you know." Facing accountability. At the gate, Captain Douglas stood waiting, his expression neutral but serious. Next to him was a sharply dressed woman with a tablet in hand, clearly an airline executive. Behind them, 2 security officers lingered, their presence a silent reminder of the stakes. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," the captain said, extending a hand. "Thank you for your patience. This is Ms. Angela Carter from our executive team." Angela stepped forward, her demeanor polished but apologetic. "I want to personally apologize for what happened on this flight," she said. "We take incidents like this very seriously, and I assure you there will be a thorough investigation." Rachel studied Angela carefully. "We appreciate your apology," she said, "but this isn't just about an investigation. This is about systemic change. What happened to us is part of a larger problem." Angela nodded, her expression earnest. "You're absolutely right," she said. "We're already taking steps to address the situation, including revisiting our training protocols and accountability measures. I'd like to invite you to a meeting with our leadership team to discuss your experience and how we can improve." Rachel glanced at Isaac, who gave her a subtle nod. "We'll consider it," she said, "but actions speak louder than words. We'll be watching closely to see if the airline follows through." Angela nodded again. "Understood," she said, "and thank you for your willingness to work with us." As the meeting concluded, Rachel and Isaac walked away from the gate, their heads held high. The events of the flight had been exhausting, but they knew their battle wasn't over. This wasn't just about them. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what they had. From adversity to change. The walk through the terminal was surreal. Passengers who had been silent observers on the plane now lingered near coffee shops and newsstands, their gazes following Rachel and Isaac. Whispers filled the air, some quiet words of encouragement, others laced with curiosity. Rachel and Isaac remained composed, their steps deliberate, their minds already planning their next moves. When they reached the baggage claim, they were met by Rachel's longtime friend and legal colleague, Morgan Daniels. Dressed sharply in a navy suit, Morgan's presence was commanding. Her expression softened when she saw Rachel and Isaac. "You two all right?" Morgan asked, cutting straight to the point. Rachel nodded, but her eyes betrayed the weight of the ordeal. "We're fine. Just exhausted." Morgan gave her a knowing look. "I've been monitoring everything. This story is starting to circulate. A passenger must have tipped off the media. They're already speculating about racial bias and systemic issues in the airline industry." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "That didn't take long." "Things like this never stay quiet," Morgan said. "The question is, how do you want to handle it? Do you want to make a public statement?" Isaac crossed his arms, his gaze thoughtful. "Not yet. We need more leverage. Right now, the airline is scrambling, but they're still in damage control mode. Let them stew for a bit." Rachel turned to Morgan. "What's the response from the airline so far?" Morgan smirked. "The usual. We take these matters seriously, and we're investigating the incident. They've issued a boilerplate apology, but nothing substantial." Rachel's jaw tightened. "That's not enough. They need to do better." Morgan nodded. "Agreed. I've drafted a preliminary letter of demands, policy changes, diversity training, and an external audit of their practices. We'll hit them where it hurts, their reputation and their bottom line." Isaac smiled faintly. "I knew there was a reason we called you." Morgan chuckled. "You think I'm letting anyone mess with my best friend? Not a chance. The catalyst for change." The three of them left the airport and headed to Morgan's downtown office, where they could strategize in private. The office was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling city. Morgan poured coffee for everyone before spreading documents across the glass conference table. "All right," Morgan began. "Let's map out our plan. First, we need to solidify your story. Everything that happened on that plane needs to be documented in detail." Rachel leaned forward, her tone sharp. "We've got video evidence and witnesses who've offered to provide statements. That alone gives us a strong foundation." Morgan nodded, jotting notes on her tablet. "Good. Second, we'll prepare to take this public, but only if the airline doesn't meet our demands. This isn't just about your experience. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen." Isaac's eyes narrowed. "And we need to make sure they know we're serious. This isn't about a one-time apology or a slap on the wrist for release. This is about systemic accountability." Morgan tapped her pen against the table. "Agreed. I'll have my team start researching the airline's history, complaints, lawsuits, anything that points to a pattern of behavior. If there's dirt, we'll find it." Rachel glanced at her phone, which had been buzzing incessantly. She scrolled through the notifications, messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had heard about the incident. One message caught her eye. "I saw what happened. I've been in your shoes. Let me know if I can help." She showed the message to Morgan, who raised an eyebrow. "Looks like this is striking a chord," Morgan said. "We could use that to our advantage. Build a coalition. Amplify other voices." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "If we can show this is a systemic issue, not just a one-off, we'll have even more leverage, turning the tables." Later that evening, Rachel and Isaac sat in Morgan's office, surrounded by papers and laptops. The airline had finally issued a more formal response, but it was still generic: apologies, promises to investigate, and vague commitments to improvement. Rachel frowned as she read the statement. This is nothing but PR fluff. They're trying to ride this out without making real changes. Isaac leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but resolute. "Then we escalate." Morgan smirked. "Now you're speaking my language." The next day, Rachel and Isaac released a carefully crafted statement through Morgan's firm. It detailed their experience with clarity and professionalism, highlighting the broader implications of what had occurred. The statement called for accountability, transparency, and a commitment to systemic change within the airline industry. The statement went viral within hours. News outlets picked it up, and hashtags began trending on social media. #FlyWithDignity, #AccountabilityInThere, and #ChangeTheCulture. Passengers from around the world shared their own stories of mistreatment, creating a groundswell of support for Rachel and Isaac. The airline's reckoning. The airline's leadership couldn't ignore the growing backlash. Angela Carter, the executive who had met Rachel and Isaac at the gate, reached out personally to schedule a meeting. The email was formal but urgent. "We'd like to discuss next steps and potential solutions. Please let us know when you're available." Rachel read the email aloud, then looked at Morgan. "What do you think?" Morgan leaned back, her fingers steepled. "They're panicking. That's a good sign. But don't let them off easy. This meeting is your chance to demand real change." Rachel and Isaac agreed. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, giving them time to prepare. In the meantime, their story continued to dominate headlines. Public figures voiced their support, and advocacy groups reached out to offer resources. The pressure on the airline intensified, and rumors swirled about potential layoffs, lawsuits, and a major overhaul of leadership. The meeting. When the day of the meeting arrived, Rachel and Isaac walked into the airline's corporate headquarters with their heads held high. They were met by Angela Carter and several senior executives, all of whom looked visibly uncomfortable. The meeting began with more apologies and promises, but Rachel quickly redirected the conversation. "We're not here for apologies," she said firmly. "We're here for action." Isaac leaned forward. "This isn't just about us. It's about every passenger who's been treated unfairly. What are you going to do to fix the culture that allowed this to happen?" Angela nodded, her expression serious. We've reviewed your demands, and we're prepared to take the following steps. Mandatory bias training for all staff, an independent audit of our customer service protocols, and a public commitment to transparency moving forward. Rachel listened carefully, her expression unreadable. And how will you ensure accountability? Angela hesitated, then replied, We'll establish an oversight committee that includes external advisors. They'll have the authority to review complaints and recommend disciplinary actions. Rachel exchanged a glance with Isaac, who gave a small nod. It's a start, she said, but we'll be watching. If we don't see real progress, we won't hesitate to escalate again. The executives nodded solemnly, aware of the power Rachel and Isaac now wielded. The meeting ended on a cautious but hopeful note, with both sides agreeing to a timeline for implementing the proposed changes. A legacy of change. Weeks later, Rachel and Isaac sat in their living room, watching a news segment about the airline's new initiatives. Their experience had sparked a national conversation about bias and accountability, leading to reforms not just within the airline but across the industry. This isn't the end, Rachel said, her voice quiet but determined. Isaac nodded. No, but it's a step in the right direction. They clinked glasses, a silent toast to their resilience and the change they had fought to create. For Rachel and Isaac, the journey wasn't just about justice. It was about making the skies truly friendly for everyone.